And good morning, everybody. David Cross here today. Um, Happy Saturday. Hope your week went well and that you have some downtime or whatever your hobbies are over the weekends. I wanted to come back with a video today on the introduction to Node-RED. And with the past video yesterday, we did the intro with the new subnet by VLAN ID API calls and the custom workflow. And I wanted to show the IP address one today because it does get a little bit more complex, and it introduces a number of other APIs and decision making that you may want to incorporate into your workflows and or your API projects as well. So very similar to our new subnet, and again the power of Node-RED being that we can create any kind of endpoint to represent an API and to have Node-RED be the server for that. So we're proxying again. Node-RED is proxying calls to IPControl in the back end using the RESTful APIs and then presenting options back to the client and performing that server function. Now our API for the new API is a GET function as well as our pass. So I wanted to demonstrate on the URL to make this process easier how this would look using parameter supply. As we process the input, very similar to what I had done before, I am processing all of the payload in a programmatic way versus using the nodes to do these changes. And this is for my edification for learning how to program, and might be for yours too. So as you start to look at more capabilities of the core nodes of Node-RED available, none of this is really necessary for coding because you can do it all through the built-in things. But again, I'm doing this because I want to learn, and I hope that you do too. So in terms of the packet, once we're getting this payload, and in this payload, we're expecting a few items. The first being the VLAN ID, and then we're also expecting something like a state. And in terms of the IP address assignment process versus the child block, we want to specify a quantity. It's almost very rare that anybody just needs one IP address anymore. And in the virtualization of these host systems and automation of that, you're going to start looking at, I need 5 addresses, or I need 10 or 20 or whatever that number is. So I wanted to make that available for them. And again, our objective of this API, just as before we get moving through this, is that our clients, we want to have an open system that they can request IP addresses, process it through their programmatic means, scripting, etc., and to be able to request one or many IP addresses based on a VLAN ID as the lookup field, which we're also going out and processing that if there's a state, we'll narrow that lookup field to that state. And then what I'm performing in this is an export of all of the possible subnets, and then looking at the utilization to determine which one should be selected and chosen for the IP assignment. So it's kind of complex at that point, but that's what the objective is. So in the URL parameter, when we look at the message payload, because that's what's being fed in, we're going to pull out the VLAN ID parameter, and we're going to set that into a global parameter or global variable that we can then call through any of the nodes. And this particular VLAN ID can be called globally anywhere through any of the tabs, whereas a flow narrows it down just to the tab flow. I wanted to make this global for everyone. Also the state, we're going out pulling the state if it's available. And in the quantity, we're going to default to 1. Just simple, if they don't supply it, this is what they mean. But if they do have a quantity, we're going to honor it. And we're going to have to determine if there's the quantity available once we receive that input. And that's what we're going to do. And like with all of the processing, we want to return all of the information back. So your message payload, and in this case, I'm modifying it directly. So we're returning a message payload so that it can be used in the next step of the process, which is then where we're going to start building the packet that's going to be fed into the HTTP request into IPControl to continue on with the steps. So now that we have our flow, we've gotten the VLAN and those parameters extracted and set in their variables, we're going to extract those back into our local flow so that we can pull in and define our search string, which effectively is going to do the export. And very similar to our past video, we do also construct the headers. And so I'm doing all of this in each of the flows to duplicate it for purposes here. And you can do the same or build a global process for this. And again, in the state, I'm comparing that if it is there, I want to interject that as a third lookup value for the available subnet. And if it's not there, we'll assume VLAN ID, and that we're also looking for an API enabled flag, again, through the checkbox, that's going to enable us to add new subnets to the mix and or remove subnets. And I was thinking about this last night, just sorry to go down a rat hole here, but I was thinking about when these subnets begin to run out of addresses, we may want to put some type of alerting or a threshold that says we're not going to make 100% of the available IP addresses available, but maybe 85%. And when we start to process out the utilization, it's at that time I might want to trip that API enabled flag to enable or disable based on that threshold. So I may go down that now that I'm thinking about it and do that process just to kind of demonstrate that later. But back to our current flow at hand. So here we're building again the payload, and I'm going to have either one using the if else. And then we're going to return that back into the payload. And effectively what's going to happen then is our HTTP request node is going to call our API, which in this case we're telling it to export the child blocks. So IPControl has an init export child block that when we pass this payload into it, and we also specify, as I mentioned previously, the first results position, the init export then becomes the init, the export, and the end export process all in one API call. So it's very, very efficient if you have all of the details up front, and I do, so I use that often. And the result of this, when we have this output, is if we don't have anything, again, we're going to compare this and end the process if it's null, or otherwise we want to continue because we can. But if we don't have a subnet, we can't continue with the subnet allocation process. And lastly, because what's being returned is going to be an array of items, I'm telling this that I want to process each of the return subnets. And so Node-RED has a split function that wherein every array separated by a new line or whatever is specified will be split into an individual message. So if I have 10 subnets returned in this particular export, it's going to split that into 10 different transactions from this point forward. And so here's where we're getting into the magic of this. I then split this and I tell it I want to limit this to 3 messages a second. So I'm only going to allow for 3 subnets to be processed a second. And then I'm passing that payload into a utilization function. And this is new to IPControl 10 that now allows me to go get those block details, but to pull back stats about its availability in real time. So we're not dependent upon any type of workflow upgrade or update of the utilization counters and so forth. This is real time as it stands at the time the call is made. And the reason we want to do this is we need to know, based on the quantity suggested or requested, that the subnet can support that. So I'm going to set this node.json to go ahead and set the URL for the next node and to dynamically build that URL so that it passes the IP address of the subnet. And that's what we're doing. And in the next step here, I'm going to do check available, which tells it to do a check, a get. You'll notice the URL is blank because we're creating the message.url, which is it's expecting in the previous function, and we're doing it programmatically. So we don't actually specify it here as well. We override it with the function and TLS as well. And again, what we're going to have here, we're going to rejoin all of these messages. So once I've run this task through the split, which will be 10 in our example there, I can then take all of those results and through Node-RED's join node, rejoin them all back into an array with all of their results. So now I have all 10 subnets details and all 10 subnets utilization numbers. And now I want to process all of that through a function. And that function is go out and run the block, create the available. So there are counters that tell us the number of addressable hosts in a subnet, the number that are leasable if they're allocated there, the number that are reserved, and the number that are static. So what we have then is a extraction of subtracting all of that information. I then have what's available. And if what's available is greater than the requested quantity, go ahead and add this subnet, push it into an array that tells it this is a candidate for that option, and it's going to stick it into an array of options, of subnets. And then we're going to go back down then, and we're going to get the subnet details, and we're actually going to create the import for the device based on the extract of the container information and the subnet information that we just obtained through the available utilization array. So we're going in and checking if the block results, we're going to go ahead and pull out the first subnet from that array that was available to us that matched that criteria. That's effectively how we're going to do it. Block results 0, container 0, and then the block address for that first result. Again, our message headers. And this time I'm going to have an array which is going to represent the input device JSON necessary to create the import. So we're going to dynamically generate the import device JSON, telling it to build the container dynamically. We're going to suggest the server. This would be selectable too. Domains, again, I'm hard coding. Make sure yours are set as well. And again, we're back to some things like auto-generating a host name. Absolutely powerful thing through IPControl we all take advantage of, but it gives you some type of dynamic name. And you could also, I've done this with other customers, they have their own very, very complex naming, wherein they can go out and call other REST APIs, passing these details, getting that name, pulling it back into this call, and using it forward with this process. And I highly would recommend that too if you have that kind of requirement. Node-RED is extremely capable here. And then what we're doing with this, again, we're building the array, pushing the payload, which is this input device JSON structure. Or else, if it's here, we're going to go out and we're going to create the quantity. So if it's 1, we're going to go ahead and create 1. And if it's multiples, we're just going to go ahead and run these multiples here. And then lastly, here in the message URL, we then have the import device URL that we're going to pass dynamically or programmatically into the HTTP request node. And I'm then telling it that the payload now is an array, which is the multi-payload. And that the message block, which we're going to set a new property or a new variable moving forward into the payload, which is going to be the block results, which basically tells us what subnet was selected. So we're going to copy that value out of the payload. We're going to create a new variable. That new variable is going to move forward in the request, but it's not going to overwrite the payload. So we're moving it out of the payload into a copying into a different variable we can use. And then because we have multiples, we're going to take that array and we're going to process it and we're going to split out each of the individual IP addresses, which again, I'm going to limit by number. And then I want to go out and get more information about that IP address by calling and importing that IP. So we're going to split out the import payload and then we're going to import those individually. We then are going to take each individual IP address that's run and we're going to tell it to get the IP address that was just assigned. So now that we have a new IP, we only know what the address is. We now want to get it from the IP in IPControl and bring it back into the flow so that we can see the host name and other details that are being assigned here. And passing that message URL forward to the get IP details, which again, there's nothing here, but it's a get. And then when all of these gets are done through all of the IP addresses that have been assigned, like with the subnet utilization flows, we're going to rejoin these back automatically into a single array list, which I then want to run through a process and format to do other things, which are like pull out the message default gateway and the subnet DNS servers and things that might be used later through the process. And like with the subnet VLANs, we're resetting our variables. So this is what we're doing at this last part. And then we're copying the IP results to be the payload. And lastly, we're telling it two things. Well, I'm only doing one now, but we could do multiples. I'm formatting that again through the HTML template, passing it through the mustache template, the IP results that we just resolved in the array, and it's going to expand those or enumerate those. And then it's going to output that to our endpoint, which is the request response. So if everything went well and didn't generate an error wherein it would be caught at a different section of the workflow, it would then just repeat everything or pass it back to the client. So it's pretty involved. It has quite a few different API calls in this, and that I think is a very good representation of how this workflow is really designed to work. And again, I want to preface this again that in the Diamond IP Control automation appliance and the nodes that are designed for this, that a lot of these tasks are already wrapped into a single node. So you're going to see everything collapse. It'll simplify the flow as well. But just keep that in mind as you move through and maybe look at their products as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and demonstrate it. There's a lot of talking for that. I already had one up here as well. Yeah, we're going to go back and use the example that we had with the VLANs, where we created a new VLAN based on this VLAN, 11.11.11, and I'm going to tell it that I want a quantity of 5. And then what we're going to get then is all of these workflows are being processed right now. And as you see, it's kind of building in real time as I flip through this, through the debug. And the output then should be an array in JSON format that can be passed back to the calling API and processed. And this information then has all of the details necessary that they understand with the IP, the default gateway, the DNS servers, and other details that are going to be used to configure the IP on the client, either dynamically through some orchestration tool, VMware orchestration as an example, or other chef, things like that. And once that's defined, then those IP addresses are there. They might want to update the host name or anything from there. Right? So this is a good example, I think, of the multi-calls, how that might look, what kind of structure, and how this is capable. And again, this only took an hour or so to build. So, as you think through these process, define your business process, and then let's take a look at what the nodes are. And when you understand what the business process, we can wrap these nodes around that to identify it. We can start building in alerts and notification on perhaps utilization of IP addresses or subnets, that as we're calling this in real time, we can start getting real-time metrics versus other external processes that might roll up utilization and things. So very great tool, Node-RED, and I'm going to come back and give you a couple others. I'm going to go ahead and close this one out for the two we were looking at. But there are so many different things that we can do. I think I would just kind of throw those out and give you some examples as I work through that. So maybe this weekend I'll give you a couple others and let you see how those look, and maybe they'll help you in your Node-RED workflow design. Thanks everybody for joining me. Again, hopefully not too long for you and hopefully useful. Let me know if you have any comments or things you need to see, and or if you need to see any other interfacing with IPControl. Be glad to help. Thanks everybody. Have a great weekend if we don't talk again. Thanks.